Hello and welcome again to Vintage Pens for the Modern User. Today we are going to explore the Esterbrook pen, specifically the Esterbrook J series, although we will talk a little bit about its predecessor, the Esterbrook dollar pen. Esterbrook first began making the dollar pen in 1935, and it was sold for $1, or with an upgraded nib could be had for $1.50. They again transitioned from that pen into the J series in 1943. These are very reliable and very approachable vintage pens for the modern user to consider picking up as their first vintage pens. I have an assortment of them, and we're going to look closer at them in just a moment. They came with the renew point nibs that Esterbrook offered. There were a variety of these nibs in different levels of durability. The 1000 series and 2000 series could be considered lower tier or lower grade nibs, but they were of course offered in a variety of writing points, giving the user again a lot of expressivity. And as renew point, what that meant was they could be unscrewed, taken out, discarded if they were bad, and replaced. Or if they were not bad, and perhaps you had the 9000 series nib, which is what I would recommend any modern user to find, you could of course have one pen and a few nibs that you could change out to give you options ranging from a fine or very fine flexible tip all the way up to a medium metallic tip. They also offered relief tips in fine, medium, and broad. Relief was an oblique tip, about 15 degrees offset, which would of course allow some really nuanced writing. And again, one of the reasons that I suggest modern users try vintage pens is not only because of the durability of the materials, but also for some really increased expressivity that you'll find that they provide, I think, a lot wider range of that than what you might find in a modern writing instrument. So without further ado, let's get into taking a closer look at the Esterbrook J series fountain pens. So I will begin by talking about the Esterbrook dollar pen, as I mentioned, which was the predecessor of the Esterbrook J, made in 1935 until about 1942, 43 being the year that they began a transition into the J. Now, again, as mentioned, these early pens also came with the renew point nibs, so I could unscrew this nib, take it out, and I could swap it with a nib from any other pen. Or if it was bad, like a 1000 series or 2000 series nib would be prone to wear out, I could replace it. Now on this pen, I have a very unique nib, which you will find, which is a 3000 series nib. The 3000 series is uncommon, and if you are to come across one as a modern user, you should know it's a special nib and you would be expected to pay a premium for it. It's also known as a sunburst nib because of the pattern on the nib. These had osmiridium tips and were very high quality writing points and writing nibs. So they came with the dollar series. They were phased out afterwards. Just to give you an example of the colors in the dollar series, there were more than I have here, but you see our red, this is a unique nib as well, as long as we're discussing. This 2048 nib is known as a falcon nib. You can see the edges of it are a little bit different, and it would have some flexibility to it. The dollar series can be identified by these clips, the more truncated ends, and the clips are attached differently than the J series, and they do have the nice Esterbrook signature logo on top. You can see all these are standard size, but if we compare these two here, you can see one is slightly slimmer than the other. That was also something that Esterbrook did, and they also made shorter options. But for intents and purposes of this, we're going to discuss the J series as they are more prominent, more likely to be found by the modern user looking to explore vintage. They did come in a variety of colors: red, sort of a rust orange color, green, blue, gray, and of course, black. If you are a modern user and you stumble across a vintage pen and it has a sticker on it, you should know that collectors prize this kind of condition and the information that is provided, which tells us this is an LJ. It had originally available with a DuraPoint nib or a MasterPoint nib for a price of $2.50 or $3 respectively. You should know that you can of course use these pens, but the collectors prize stickered examples, and so there are plenty of options out there, and I would recommend, as a modern user that wants to use your pen, that you save stickered pens for those who may prefer to preserve the nuance. This has a 9000 series nib, which has a better tipping point on it. And again, just like the others I mentioned, the nibs can be removed. Now, as you notice, I'm having difficulty with this, and you may have difficulty. It's important not to force anything. If a nib does not want to be removed, usually a simple soaking in water to remove some dried ink will free it up nicely. To give you an example of the changeability of nibs, I'll demonstrate with these as I know they are removable. So here we have a 2556 nib with a little bit of ink in it still. It can be unscrewed, and here from the dollar pen, which has that 3000 sunburst nib, I could take that out and I could slide it in here. And just like that, I have another nib without having to buy another pen. So again, if you would like to have a variety of nib points and a variety of options to write with, this allows you to do that by buying one pen itself, and the nibs are available at a variety of places that you can buy and therefore swap in to your heart's content until you find exactly what you want, or if you find a few options. Perhaps you want to bold signature, but on everyday writing you want fine. Another thing that you can see here is the difference in size. Just as with the dollar pens, the J series were made in a few different sizes. In my right hand here is the standard size J. In my left hand here is the slender size J, and the model designation was LJ. They also were made short slender, which was called SJ. Now looking at the short slender pens, they also made something called the purse pens, which were lovely pens geared more towards the female market, although nowadays there's no reason anyone can't use them, as was the case then. They came in a lovely array of pastel colors, which people often enjoy. You can collect the rainbow, as it were. Same filling mechanism and same nib unit idea, where you can unscrew and replace with whatever nib you desire to use. Some of these plastics are a little more fragile, especially around the cap lip, so you should know that. And be careful if you decide to post a pen like these pastel colored pens. Certainly can be done, but these are a little more collectible and a little more delicate. No reason not to use them, just something to be aware of. Again, when you talk about collectors, the early Esterbrook purse pens also came in sets, and they had these nice pouches. Again, here we see one with a sticker on it, the Petite Pack, including pen and pencil, for $5. And the pack actually matches the color, that ochre, I believe, the purplish color of this. And so just like with many companies, there is a pencil that matches a pen. So if you really were someone who was seeking a set, you could do so here. Now, of course, vintage pens for the modern user would be incomplete if we didn't discuss using the pen. Before I get into that, let me show you the pen. I have one here that I have taken the section out of. Doing something like this is best done by someone who's experienced in it, as it does require some heating for the safety of the pen, not to damage the materials. But you can see here we have a barrel. I've removed the J bar, which is the spring, from another pen, so you can get a sense of what happens. When the lever is pulled up on this pen, it depresses down on the J bar inside. And the J bar is sprung at the back, and as you press down, the flat piece will of course compress your sac completely. And as you release it, then the vacuum created will draw ink into the pen. This is an old sac. This is an original. It says Esterbrook on the sac. This hasn't been replaced, and if you were to find one like this, it would be good to replace it. Although it's often collectability of finding things that are marked as good, these pens are quite common, and using a pen like this would certainly not be a problem, even replacing the original Esterbrook sac. It isn't uncommon to find Esterbrook's with sacs in them, but I would always recommend, before using an Esterbrook or any pen vintage, that you make sure that it is completely overhauled and ready to go. So here we go. Let's use a vintage Esterbrook. This is a standard J model pen, as I've explained. It has a 2000 series nib in it, 2556. And just like with a modern pen you may use bottled ink with, a piston filling pen for example, so too would you with a vintage pen. So I have a tissue handy here. I have my ink well here. I'm using Waterman's Mysterious Blue. I tend to recommend good, reliable vintage inks for these pens. Waterman's, of course, still makes the ink. I've lifted the lever, I've put the pen into the inkwell, and I spring the lever back and I wait only a few seconds. It does not take long for the ink to fill the sac. Then I've taken it out. Now I'm going to rest it here on the napkin, and the first thing you should do is replace the cap on your ink container, because the last thing we want is a bottle of spilled ink. Then you can of course wipe the excess from the nib, set your napkin aside, feel free to post the pen, and then take a time to write something. As with any fountain pen, you should let the pen do the work. And as I mentioned in the previous video, I'm a lefty. Little camera wobble, pardon that. I'm a lefty, but that shouldn't deter anybody from writing. The pen writes under its own weight, and you do not need to push down. If you find yourself with a scratchy nib, check the way you're writing first. A pen should be very smooth and should write under its own weight. So once you've written a bit, you can of course recap the pen. Nothing wrong with that. And when it's time to clean the pen, then assuming you've used all the ink, you won't need to dispel any ink back into the bottle. But as we know, I have not. I'm going to expel the excess ink here back into my ink well. Again, one run down enough is all you need to worry about.
You do see I have some ink on my fingers. This is not something to be afraid of, and it's not due to the nature of the vintage pen, simply due to the user of the vintage pen, yours truly. Now, flushing a pen out like this, the same operation that you would do when you fill the pen. Place it in the water. You can see already that there's a lot of ink there in the feed and in the nib. But in order to express all the ink, you'll flip the lever. That'll draw more water into the sac, and then you can cycle the ink out. You can do that multiple times. Often I have a second container where I expel the used water ink into, so that I'm cycling back and forth and keeping the water in one jar clean. It's important to note that when you're using a vintage pen with a sac, it's unlikely you're going to get the pen perfectly clean. And I know there are those that really like that when they're using their inks and they want to explore different inks. So if that's you, be patient. You can flush it a few times and go as long as you can. Then I often recommend you find yourself a jar, and you could place a paper towel in the bottom, and then just to draw excess ink through capillary action, you can place the pen down like this. And that over a period of 12 hours or so will kind of draw out the extra ink or water and help you make sure your pen is completely flushed. One final parting note about these pens is they also came as desk sets. So if you're somebody who prefers a desk set, you can of course get the Magic 8-Ball here. It's a popular desk set. You see I have here the desk pen box, complete with paper. This is again stuff that collectors like, but I would not be surprised if users would enjoy finding this sort of information handy. This is what we call ephemera, and it does provide quite a lot of nice information about the pen. So it shows you here the different writing styles that can be found in the different series, from fine to medium to manifold, renew point replacement, guarantee, etc., etc. I hope you've enjoyed this brief video about the Esterbrook dollar pen, and if you are a modern user looking to go vintage, I highly recommend that you explore these pens. Again, they are a variety of shapes, a little bit of time period variations, and simply fun to explore, easy to use, easy to maintain. Esterbrook. What's not to love? Happy writing, everyone.